Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. Welcome if you are new here, and welcome back to 31 days of December. It's Boxing Day, and I am avoiding downtown as much as possible. So I thought I would put together a video for you. I'm going to just read another story before we get back into a lot of our more in-depth topics, just because I'm enjoying story time as much as you are. This one is called Grandfather's Clock. By 2 o'clock, Vi Wesson figured that she was ready for the party. She'd spent all the previous day cleaning her house, and it was in a near spotless state. The food had all been made that very morning and was sitting in the refrigerator on fancy trays under stretched sheets of plastic wrap. The Christmas tree had been decorated a week earlier, and the gifts that had been wrapped a month earlier and purchased back during the summer were stacked beneath it. Vi even had her hair set and her minimal amount of makeup applied, and the outfit that she planned to wear. The green wool slacks with the new cream silk blouse was hanging on the peg behind her bedroom door. Everything was ready, with hours to go. So when the clock repair fellow arrived to fix Big Len, she had all the time in the world to chat with him. It was sort of a joke, you know. My late husband's name was Leonard, and it was his clock, so we called it Big Len after the one in England. Like, you've heard of that famous clock in England, Big Ben? The clock repairman, who was opening his case of tools and parts on the freshly vacuumed carpet, glanced at Vi and nodded. "Of course you have," said Vi. "You're a clock expert, aren't you? Do you want tea or coffee, maybe?" The repairman looked briefly at Vi once more, this time with a shake of his head. "No thanks, ma'am," he said. "Suit yourself," she said. She settled down into a dining room chair that was close to where the man was working and lit a cigarette. There was nothing like having a nice visit along with a cigarette. "My gosh," Vi said as she looked over the man's selection of instruments. "You sure have to carry a lot of doodads." "Well," said the repairman, "you can never tell what you might need. Now, what's the problem with this clock?" "My husband died." The repairman looked confused at first, and then uncomfortable. "That's a shame," he finally said in a voice that was just a shade louder and a bit slower than usual. "But about the clock?" he asked, and he patted the walnut case of the antique grandfather clock for clarity. "Oh, I'm not slow," said Vi, and she blew out a stream of smoke. "I'm not crazy either. The problem with the clock is that my husband is dead. But I was hoping you might be able to do something about that. The clock, that is, not Leonard. Lord knows I loved him, but the state he'd be in now, I don't want him back, thank you very much." The repairman scratched his head and tried to follow Vi's stream of consciousness conversation. "Okay, the clock doesn't work at all?" he asked. "Not a tick," said Vi, and she flicked the ash from her cigarette into the ashtray that sat next to her wrist on the table with the lace tablecloth. "It's not slow, or fast, or anything. It just doesn't go. So I thought I'd try one more time to get it fixed up, because I'm having family for a Christmas party tonight, and my daughters, I've got 2 of them, they're Sandra and Gayleen. They'd sure like to see that old clock running again." The repairman examined the wood panels of the old clock, and then gently opened the case. A layer of fine dust had settled on the inner workings. Vi shook her head. "Doesn't matter how much you clean," she said. "There's always something that still needs a cleaning." "So you said you've had other people try to fix this?" "2 times, said Vi, and she held up 2 fingers for emphasis. "They couldn't find a damn thing, pardon my French. Said there was no reason it shouldn't be running, and they were supposed to be a couple of the best clockmakers in Winnipeg. Skilled craftsmen. That's what Sandra said. But I figured they couldn't fix it because they didn't know really what was wrong with it. So that's why I called you. And that's why I'm telling you up front that the clock isn't working because Leonard's dead. So now that you know, you can do whatever it is that you have to do in that kind of situation." "Look, ma'am," the repairman said, "I just don't understand what you're getting at here. Maybe I should go." He started to fold up his toolkit. "I'll pay you cash over and above," said Vi. "What do you mean?" I mean, I'll pay the bill that your boss sends me, but I'll also give you a $50 bill all of your own if you can fix this. The repairman took a good long look at Vi Wesson and then tried to size her up. She seemed very serious and not particularly crazy, despite the things she had been saying. That's a pretty big tip, said the repairman. It's worth it to me, said Vi. She stubbed out her cigarette and went into the kitchen. The repairman heard the china clink of a sugar bowl lid, and Vi returned to the dining room with a crisp $50 bill. My Sandra, she's got a baby on the way, and for a present, I'd like to give her the clock. It's an heirloom, and Leonard would have wanted it passed down. But there's not much point in it if the damn thing won't work. I suppose, said the repairman. He had his eye on the 50. He was thinking that he could buy his kid a new computer game to put under the tree. He was thinking that would show his ex-wife who the better parent was. Vi saw the man looking at the money and knew that she had a deal. She pressed the bill into his hand. Here you go, she said, in advance. Now, why don't you let me get you that coffee, and then I'll tell you exactly what happened to Big Len. 5 minutes later, Vi and the repairman were both seated at the dining room table. Each held a mug of steaming coffee, and a plate of frosted sugar cookies sat between them. You can eat all of those that you want, said Vi, as she snapped her lighter open and put the flame to the tip of another cigarette. I've got fancier ones saved for the party. She started. She stared expectantly at the repairman and the cookies until finally he took one. Thanks, he mumbled, and took a small bite. Oh, that's fine, said Vi. I like to feed you young people, although you're too much for the sweets. I can tell you, a little bit of fruit and a little sugar in my coffee is all I need. You were going to tell me what happened to the clock. Yeah, the clock, said Vi. She turned slightly and looked it up and down. It's beautiful, hey? Beautiful old antique. It's been in the Wesson family longer than any living Wesson. Always belonged to the oldest male heir. And you know, it's funny, she continued. I don't know too much about my own family. Not too much of the history, But Len, he told stories about his folks all the time. It was important to him, all of that history that the Wessons had. So now, I know it better than my own. I was married to Len for 35 years and ended up being more of a Wesson than I ever was a Clark. That was my maiden name, Clark. Now, if I was waiting in the doctor's office and the nurse came out and called for Violet Clark, I wouldn't even look up from my magazine. Now, the clock, I think, the one who bought it, was Len's great-grandfather, but I'm not 100% sure on that. What I do know for sure is that his grandfather, John Wesson, brought it to him when he and his bride came from Ontario. Everyone said they were crazy to be lugging such a thing out at the frontier. This was 1890, you know, and Winnipeg was a pretty decent-sized little burg, but you couldn't tell that to anyone who lived in the East. Anyway, John and Kate Wesson were new married, and this clock was a wedding gift from his father, and he had his mindset that it was going with them. So they paid the freight, and John and Kate and the grandfather clock all came out here together on the CPR. Now, when they got here, they were in for a shock. There were a lot of people in those days, but the sort of civilization that John Wesson was used to hadn't quite caught up with all of them. From what I heard, parts of the city was no more than a scattered out collection of rough shacks, and between them was mud streets that got baked hard and dusty in the summertime and got as sticky and as mucky as a bog come wet weather. John and Kate hadn't been here for more than a few days when they got a feel for that mud. They just got themselves a place to live, so they loaded up all of their things into a cart, and they left the Royal Hotel and made their way out to the little house. Well, the further away from the main street they got, the softer and muckier the road got. Finally, about a quarter mile from the house, the cart got stuck so bad they couldn't budge it another inch. So John says to Kate, "We'll just have to pack everything the rest of the way." And they did. They made trip after trip, wading through the mud, and carried in everything except this clock here. They couldn't carry the clock by themselves, and the sun was going down. So they knew they couldn't find anyone to help them until the next day. So Kate says, "Come on, let's go to bed and we'll figure this out tomorrow." But John Wesson wouldn't hear of it. He told her to go on to the house, and he settled himself down in the cart next to the clock. Do you believe that? Not even a week in Winnipeg, which was a rough place, mind you, and he lets his wife sleep alone so he can protect his clock. Later, one of his boys asked him how he could have done that, and he said he was trying to bring some civilization to this godforsaken hole. By the time John and Kate got truly settled and had their family, it wasn't such a godforsaken hole anymore. They had proper streetcar service and milk delivery every morning. The clock probably didn't stick out like a sore thumb anymore. All those kids heard about the clock, though. They heard the story of how it was passed down to their dad, how it came out on the west on a train wrapped in a tight patchwork quilt. Those kids knew that the clock was part of their heritage, and that someday it would go to John Jr. But here's what happened. Before the old man died, John Jr. died. He went away to serve in the First World War, and never came back. So the clock eventually went to the other son, and that was the first Leonard Wesson. By the time that Leonard was old enough to serve, well, the war was over. Everything was finished, so he got himself a good job instead and a wife. Her name was Florence. They settled down and started having babies, and my Leonard was one of them, Leonard Jr. I think things were okay for them for the first few years, but then the Depression hit, and it hit Leonard Wesson Sr. particularly hard. Because his good job happened to be at one of the big banks that was on Portage Avenue, he lost that job, and when he was lucky enough to work after that, it was at things that didn't bring in nearly the money or the prestige. I know he sold door to door for a while, spices and what have you, household gadgets, but people weren't buying many spices when they couldn't afford the food to put underneath them. I guess one time when things were at their worst, Florence said to Len Sr., "I know a fellow who would pay us quite a few dollars for the clock, and then we could put a decent meal into the children for once." Leonard Sr. just flat out refused. I guess they had a bit of a go-around that night. My hubby was about 10 years old then, so he remembered it just so. The whole family sat around in their worn clothes, sharing a couple of fried potatoes while that grandfather clock chimed away like they were sitting at the Ritz. I wished I met Len Sr. I think he must have been a character. But he died in 1960, a couple of years before Len and I got together. So you see, when I met up with Len, he already had the clock. It had already got passed down to him. I was 25 years old when Len and me got married, and he was about 40. My mother didn't think too much of that. If he was old and had some money, she used to say, but he's just old. She thought I'd have a better time with someone more my own age. But Len was good to me, which was more than I could say for some of my own relatives at the time, so I went right ahead. My mother was right about the money, though. We didn't have too much at first. When we were saving for this place, we lived in a couple of tiny little apartments where you had to climb up 3 flights of stairs with the groceries and the laundry. I don't miss that, I tell you. It'd be so hot in the summertime. I wished I could just walk around naked, pardon my saying so, and the flies would be buzzing just constant, enough to drive you crazy. And there was hardly room for anything useful, let alone this old clock. But every place we lived, it had to be there. One time, I remember when we had just had Sandra. Len and me had a huge fight about that clock. Sandra was about 3, I guess, and she'd been making pictures with her crayons. Yes, she ran out of paper after a while, though, because she started drawing on the floor. Then she moved to the wall, and then just before Len caught her, she made one tiny little line at the base of the grandfather clock. Well, Lord, you'd have thought she committed a murder. Len gave her a walloping, only time ever as I recall, and then he sat her down and delivered this roaring lecture about the importance of the clock. After a while, I'd had enough. I said to him, "Len, leave her alone now. She's your child. That bloody clock is just a thing." Well, I tell you, I've never said anything like that again. Not that he said anything or did anything much, but the look he gave me stopped me in my tracks. I knew then that however he felt about the clock, I just didn't understand it. And I let it be. Sometimes that's the only thing to do. We had Gayleen a little while after that, and then I asked Len if he wanted another baby, but he said no. He was almost 50 then, and I think the very thought of having another little baby bawling all night long made him feel wore out. So we quit after the 2 girls. That was our family. I was always happy with that, I had my daughters to do things with, but sometimes I wondered if Len would have been happier with a son. I wondered if we should have tried one more time for a boy. But then I asked him. He said no, he was just fine and satisfied. But that was Len. He didn't complain much. It was the lack of complaining that did him in, I think. By the time we knew he had cancer, it was everywhere. That's what the doctor said. That it was so many places there was no point in doing any operations or chemo or anything. It ended up we just brought him home. He stayed here for a few weeks until me and the girls couldn't keep him comfortable anymore. Then he went to the hospital. That was 2 years ago, right about this time. I used to spend hours and hours at the hospital, even at the end when everybody told me that he didn't know I was there. I didn't believe that. I knew it made a difference. But anyway, I couldn't be there every minute, and one day I came home for a little while to change my clothes and have a nap in my own bed. I walked in the door, sat down in that chair, that green swivel rocker right there, and I closed my eyes for a minute. It was so peaceful to be here where it was quiet, where there was no hospital noise. All I could hear was the hum of the fridge motor and the tick-tock of Len's grandfather clock. So I was sitting there, and I was almost asleep, I think, and suddenly the clock stops ticking. It froze. Just like that. Stopped making noise, and the pendulum there stopped swinging. The hands weren't moving around anymore, and I had a bad feeling. A real dark kind of bad feeling. The phone rang, and I knew it was going to be someone from the hospital telling me that Len had died. And was it? The repairman's cup of coffee was empty, and the front of his shirt was dusted with dry crumbs of Vi's homemade sugar cookies. He didn't notice. He was wrapped up in the story. Oh yeah, he was dead all right. And the clock hasn't ticked a beat since. None of those skilled craftsmen of Sandra's can figure out what's wrong with it. But I know. What? Well, said Vi, and she swept a few crumbs from the tablecloth onto her hand and deposited them in the ashtray. Well, I think it's because it doesn't belong to anyone anymore. The clock was always important to the Wesson men. The women never cared for it as much, and now there are no more Wesson men. The repairman looked at the grandfather clock and at his tool case spread out on the carpet beside it. Then he looked at Vi. I don't think I can fix that, he said. Vi nodded. There was a little sadness in her eyes. I suppose I didn't really expect that you could, she said, but you can keep the money. What for? The repairman wanted the 50, but didn't want to take it unfairly. Vi shrugged. You can keep it because you listened to my story. I never told it to anyone before now. Just then, the telephone rang. Both Vi and her guest jumped a little at the sound. Oh boy, she said nervously. Who's that now? Better not be someone saying they can't make it to the party. She scurried off to answer the telephone in the hall and left the repairman sitting by himself. The man took another long look at the clock and shook his head. He knelt down on the carpet and began to fold up his tool case. He could hear the hum of the refrigerator. He could hear the muted, unintelligible words of Vi Wesson's telephone conversation. And as he snapped the case shut, he heard something else. It was a groaning. The rusted mechanical groaning of something that had sat still for a long time. Something that was attempting to wrench itself into action. The noise came from the grandfather clock. The repairman looked up in time to see the case of the clock shudder. Then there was a moment of silence, and then the rhythmic ticking began and the pendulum started to swing. The repairman jumped to his feet and took several steps away from the clock. Ma'am, he began to call out before remembering that his hostess was busy on the phone. The clock was ticking steadily and exactly the right speed. The pendulum moved smoothly, as though it had not suffered 2 years of strange paralysis. The repairman watched in wonder and let out a little laugh. It was then that Vi walked back into the room. Her face was flushed, her eyes were bright. Well, I don't know what you're laughing about, young fella, but I just got some good news. That was my son-in-law, Martin. He's got hair down to his behind, but he's a good sort, and he just told me that Sandra had the baby. It's a little early, and now there's 2 people not coming to my party, but everyone's healthy and fine. Well, that's nice. I'm glad to hear that, said the repairman. And then he pointed to the clock. And look at this, Mrs. Wesson. Your clock's working again. Vi Wesson looked at the grandfather clock. Her jaw dropped, and for a moment, she appeared stunned. but then began to laugh. Then I guess I don't have to tell you, she said when she finally stopped and caught her breath. Tell me what? Sandra's baby, said Vi. It's a boy. I hope you enjoyed that feel-good story as much as I did. I love things like that. I have actually heard a lot of people's watches stopping at the exact time that they have died and people holding on to those memories, as well as lots of other things. If you like the story, please give it a thumbs up. Leave a comment below if you've had any experiences with clocks stopping and starting again mysteriously. Please subscribe if you haven't already, as that would make me so happy. Turn on the notification bell so that you can keep up to date with whenever I upload videos, like every day for the rest of this month, and then again in the new year. And I think that's all for me. I'll catch you guys tomorrow.